Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. Today we'll be discussing Sheltered Harbor and the importance of Sheltered Harbor for the financial sector. My name is Andy Hurt. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Cobalt Iron. Today I have with me Carlos Recalde, who is the President and CEO of Sheltered Harbor. Carlos, you want to say a word or two?
Thank you, Andy. We're going to spend a little time giving you a sense of what Sheltered Harbor is. I can tell you that I have been with the initiative since it started about 6 years ago, and we have had over 900 of the industry's best subject matter experts work through an extreme scenario, which we have confidence now. The solution scales from very small organizations to very large.
Excellent. Thank you, Carlos. All right, so the agenda for today, first of all, we're going to hit on what the current state of data vulnerability is. Then we're going to get into what exactly is Sheltered Harbor and why is it so important to financial sector as well as to the regulators. And then finally, for organizations that are looking to engage Sheltered Harbor and become certified, what does that process look like? And then finally, we're going to dig a little bit into the partner ecosystem to help make that happen and go down that path. So that's the agenda that we're going to cover off here. So first things first, what is the current state of data vulnerability? I mean, the reality is that cyber attacks are extremely real. They're ever present, and unfortunately, they're growing leaps and bounds. In 2021, most of cyber attacks actually were starting to start to go after the backup infrastructure. And maybe that's not all that big of a surprise given the fact that organizations do invest in backup and recovery infrastructure to serve as that last line of defense against cyber threats. I recently just read a report from the Enterprise Strategy Group that stated that in 2022, most board of directors kind of have, three key projects. One of those being, what is their company's cyber resiliency plan? It's kind of my hope that, because this has been elevated, and my guess is it's been elevated for a variety of reasons, but one of them is that the average cost of a cyber attack in 2021 was roughly $4 million per attack. And that doesn't even take into consideration, the public relation nightmare, brand reputation, customer trust, et cetera. So those are things that, are above and beyond the $4 million. So it's kind of my hope that because this has reached the board of directors' attention, that organizations, companies will start doing the right thing and really start investing in solutions. Because to be candid, this isn't really a technology issue. There's technology out there today that can help solve this. And a lot of what we'll talk about from a Sheltered Harbor perspective aligns towards that. It's really been a business issue where it hasn't been top priority until now. And I'm hopeful that 2022 is kind of the beginning of really investing in technology to prevent these types of attacks and do the right thing for these customers, employees, as well as their shareholders. So Carlos, that's kind of what I'm seeing from a backup and recovery vantage point. I'd love to hear what you are seeing primarily as it relates to data vulnerability within the financial sector and how it relates to what the regulators are saying.
Well, first off, relative to regulators, I do want to add, for those who don't know, Sheltered Harbor started as a result of an exercise, a joint public-private exercise that was really pressed on us by the regulators. Back in 2015, they postulated a scenario: what would happen if a bank or a brokerage or other financial institution got wiped out by a cyber attack? And back in 2015, this was almost a hypothetical scenario, except that we had seen this happen to Sony Pictures in 2014-15. That got really the public side, the regulators, thinking about what would happen, how would we deal with it? When the industry looked at it, after we stopped arguing that it could never happen to us and started just thinking, what if it did? The recognition was, we don't have a good answer. That institution goes operationally wiped out. It was financially solid a few seconds ago, and now it's fundamentally off the planet. What would happen to all of their customers? How would we ever resolve the situation when nobody knows who the customers are and what their balances are? and how would those customers continue to move on? And the focus was very much on the consumer, which is the concern was, we're going to have a panic that is going to move way beyond that organization. That caused the creation of Sheltered Harbor. And because of the way we were created, we are privately funded. But we also regularly, I meet with the regulators at least monthly, most of the traditional alphabet soup that you're aware of in Washington, D.C. They have been very keenly involved in understanding the solution the industry has come up with. And in fact, they are very much on board with the approach that we'll talk about. So hearing from them regularly, obviously, they've been pushing now on operational resilience and cyber resilience for the last 2 or 3 years pretty loudly. And last year, it really all came to roost as obviously ransomware hit big time here in the US, including financial institutions. So the concern that was hypothetical a few years back is now very, very real on us. And the regulators are very keenly aware that we need to have answers. And they're also very comfortable that Sheltered Harbor has parts of that answer. So where are they today? Now, you're all hearing and seeing, you're getting regular posts if you're in the financial sector from the FBI, from DHS with warnings and updates and urging you to really batten down the hatches. We're expecting, particularly because of the Ukraine situation, some ramifications to come at us, most likely initially cyber, directly from Russia, who is one of the premier, adversaries in this space. So the entire public sector is got their eyes wide open around cyber in general and responses to cyber attacks specifically.
Yeah, thanks, Carlos, for that insight. And you're absolutely spot on. Sadly, as recent as last week, cyber attacks are now a common part and a common tactic used by the military. And that was case in point with Russia against Ukraine last week. So very, very relevant what you're stating here. So if you could, Carlos, would you mind kind of giving us the overview of Sheltered Harbor in the intro?
My pleasure. So first, our mission. We're here to maintain public confidence. And I think that's pretty significant. We're not the end-all answer to everything having to do with cyber, but we were put in place to deal with an extreme event, not a small issue, an organization just being wiped out. That was as extreme as we can foresee at that point. And our mission wasn't to find a specific answer. It was and is to maintain public confidence, which really forced us as an industry. We were founded by a pretty good cross-sector of the financial industry, small, medium, and large banks, brokers, credit unions, the major service providers to the industry, as well as a few of the major utilities like the Clearing House and DTCC and so forth. They're smack in the middle of everything that happens in the industry. This was our founding board. And, the focus was public confidence. What does that mean? So the first thing we had to do across a bunch of, at that point, hundreds of subject matter experts trying to figure out, well, first off, what do we mean by public confidence? And then when we figure out what that means, then how do we maintain it? And we came away with simple answers for public confidence, saying, okay, the focus was predominantly John Q. Public, the consumer. We said, actually, if we can, in very short order, within 24 hours was our mission, was our immediate target, restore the public's confidence that we know who they are and what their balances were last night. If we can do that, just give them confidence. We know who you are. We know what your balance is. Don't worry. We have an answer to this. That's step number one. Step number two, and actually we call them priority 1A and 1B because they're not, one by itself doesn't do it. 1B was, okay, make sure they can actually have access to funds against that balance. That's a much harder thing to do, but we said that we have to do within 24 hours. So Sheltered Harbor was put in to maintain public confidence. The industry recognized if we could do just those two, there's hundreds of business services that banks offer. Forget all the others for right now. For the immediate, if we can do those two, we buy time to maintain public confidence and inevitably get ourselves back on our feet. So that was the early learning from the industry saying, okay, what does this mean? And then we realized, okay, the answer to this has to come from the industry, not from an individual institution. And Sheltered Harbor was founded. Sheltered Harbor is a not-for-profit initiative. It's funded by the industry. So it's not like a consumer can go find us and say, how do I do Sheltered Harbor? This is for banks, brokers, credit unions, custodians, asset managers, and so forth. We're a not-for-profit. Our intention here is not to make money from the solution. Our intention is to determine what the right answers are for the industry in terms of standards and best practices, and then to communicate and inevitably to certify those standards. The critical piece here is that we are focused on a very, very extreme case and a very simple solution to that extreme case. Our intention was not maintain, improve business continuity, because the one thing we count on is the industry is really good at business continuity. In fact, we're too good at it, and that's why we suffer the risks of having our backup systems taken out effectively at the same time as our primary systems. I've been in the industry for a long time, and I remember back to the days when we used to talk about nonstop computing, which meant there was always something to take over. When a primary dies, a secondary kicks in automatically. This was, at the time, pretty amazing stuff. Now we just take this all for granted. But that's what allows a set of malware to make it through both our primary and secondary systems like that. And that caused us to think differently about, okay, so what's our response? And by the way, it is not purely technical. There is some technical support, but the bottom line here is we have to almost think old world. We have to be ready from a resilience perspective to operate. Well, systems are gone, data's gone. How do we operate anyway? And that sometimes says go back and get paper and pencil for some things. Some things you can actually survive without for a brief period if we are maintaining public confidence. So again, our focus, only the extreme event and nothing more. And in order to do that, we kind of had to discard, well, what happens with loans, for example? Guys, we don't care about loans on this day. On this worst of days, loans is not our biggest issue. Keeping confidence is. So that's fundamentally what Sheltered Harbor is, how we're structured, and then how we've gone about this. And at this point, we've had over 900 of the industry's subject matter experts resolve things like, what does it mean to protect that data so that we can actually give somebody access to balances? What does it mean to actually be prepared as an institution with a resilience plan that's real, that we could call on in that scenario? What does it mean to get that certified so that before the day of, we, the industry, can have confidence that that institution is truly ready? Those are things that we as an organization have done with the help of fundamentally the industry. All of this has been reviewed and vetted with the regulators. We've rerun that exercise. Since then, we're going to come back and do it again. Knowing what we now know, preparing what we've prepared, saying, are we really that much better? The concepts are. The delivery, we're still working on that. We have to get everybody doing this, every single financial institution. And we have some work to do there. And that's a place where Cobalt Iron comes to help. Because everybody can't build all this stuff from scratch, as some of our founding members did. They took our initial concepts and started building. Well, some of the bigger organizations can afford to do that. A few of the small agile organizations did it as well, but not as efficiently as products off shelf, which Cobalt Iron is bringing to market in this space.
Excellent. That's great. So in terms of, obviously when we look at this slide, Carlos, and thank you for that background. That was super helpful. I think very educational in terms of what the mission is of Sheltered Harbor. And I think you kind of hit on the financial sector benefits with public trust and credibility with regulators. And maybe you'll come back to the credibility with regulators. Mm-hmm. But I did want to touch briefly on other industries are indeed taking note. So when we first started working with Sheltered Harbor about 1.5 years ago, of course, our use case, primary use case, and still is a primary use case, is helping drive the Sheltered Harbor mission via our software as a service solution with the Data Vault. And really focusing on the financial sector. And that is absolutely what we're here to talk about today. But it is extremely intriguing and interesting that over the past year, as we're going in and talking to other Fortune 100 companies, whether or not that's whether or not that's healthcare, manufacturing, retail, these large organizations, when we bring up Sheltered Harbor, it really, really resonates. And, it's an interesting conversation because every organization has data that's mission critical. Financial industry, as Carlos mentioned, it's around account balances and account information. For healthcare, it might be HIPAA related information. And at the end of the day, when we start talking, they want to learn more about what Sheltered Harbor really means for the financial sector and how we as Cobalt Iron with our Compass SaaS-based data protection solution are helping drive that data vault. Could that be leveraged within their own organizations? And the answer is, to a large degree, yes. Data is data. And I wouldn't be surprised if, Carlos, if in a handful of years, there's a counterpart of yours, sitting within healthcare or manufacturing or retail that has their own specification that looks very, very similar to what you guys have done over the past years to develop this. And it really is an interesting conversation, because we, meaning Cobalt Iron, never really thought when we engaged with you that this would be something that would take, that other industries would really start being interested in, and really kind of be a differentiator, if you will, in terms of the value we're bringing, the solution we're bringing, and having the credibility of Sheltered Harbor backing us. So it's been a fun ride. Anything you want to hit on in terms of kind of the credibility of the regulators? You touched on it briefly on the previous, but it might be interesting to get a little bit deeper on that.
So I think, the Sheltered Harbor as a brand does have some significant credibility, and that comes from, most people know that the financial sector is typically leading when it comes to information security and resilience and so forth. And so it's not uncommon that if I'm in another industry, I want to see what are they doing in finance, because they're ahead of us here. Here's a case where Sheltered Harbor, the initiative put out by the industry, actually ran ahead of the industry to say, how do we solve for a problem that at that point didn't yet exist, but we knew was inevitable. And that by itself gives us credibility with other industries. But the more significant piece of credibility, as I said, comes from, we came from a public-private exercise. We return to those roots regularly to make sure that both the private side that created the approach and the public side that inevitably cares about it and to some extent governs this approach is, that we're in sync. This is real. This is possible. It's practical. It can be done, as opposed to just the generic. Early on when we first were created, the regulators told us they wanted to basically see 2-hour RTOs on every possible thing in the world, and realistically, it's not practical. And by the way, most importantly, every possible thing in the world is not what we have to care about in that scenario. We have to care about first public confidence, and then a series of priorities, which in most institutions understand. What are my priorities? So Sheltered Harbor's credibility comes from the breadth of its industry to start with, supported by the regulators being in sync with that. And again, other industries look to say, okay, what are the financial regulators caring about? Because obviously we all care about our bank accounts and, our assets. And,
right.
We've, as an industry, always been maybe extra regulated to make sure that we're keeping all of this safe. So it's not uncommon that others say, okay, well, if they figured out how to do that well, we should figure out how we can leverage that. And exactly to your point, while Sheltered Harbor is focused specifically on maintaining public confidence for a financial institution, much of what we have done, and in fact, much of what we release as documents, is applicable anywhere else. Our specific solutions for public confidence financial services are a specific set of data that we care about. But if you abstract this away, our resilience plans, for example, which I'll talk about shortly, can easily be saying, okay, I can do all of that same type of thing for my business. So it's entirely possible for other industries to benefit from what we are essentially leading the path in.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the marketplace today. So you want to give us a brief overview of how Sheltered Harbor works?
Sure. Thank you. So this is a super duper 300,000 foot level. Sheltered Harbor, okay, what is it? How does it work? I'm going to stay right here first. There's 3 parts to the Sheltered Harbor approach and solution. The first one that we call a data vaulting. How do we protect that data so that it is available? When everything else gets wiped out, I still have a copy of what we consider critical data. And in our case, as I said, it's enough information so that we know how to give the customer those 2 business services: access to information about their accounts, and then access to actual funds from those accounts. How do we keep it? so that it's available when everything else is wiped out. The scenario we always painted, assume everything is now silicon dust. The computer systems, they're just sitting on the floor as dust. Now what do we do? All your backups, they're also gone in dust. That's the scenario that we went after and said, okay, well, we have to know when all of that happens that there is a copy of that critical data someplace else that didn't become dust. That's the first piece that we figured out, and we'll come back to this. Well, not so surprisingly, once we figured out what that data is and how to store it properly and how to protect it and so forth, which we'll come back to, the banking institutions and the brokerage institutions that were most directly involved at the time said, okay, that's great. I have the data set aside, but that doesn't do me a whole lot of good in the worst of days, because all that ensures is that the regulators can come in and resolve my organization. They know who my accounts are, what the balances are, and the FDIC can come in and just pay them their funds, and I'm out of business. That's not good enough. What do we do with that data? And that's where we came with the concept of the resilience planning, saying it's one thing to save the data, critical, must have that. It's another thing to be ready to use it in a different form when everything else is silicon dust. And that we call a resilience planning. By the way, this is the harder part of the entire solution. Data vaulting is predominantly a technology operations project. The reason why we can have products like Cobalt Iron come in and really help make that happen pretty easily, pretty consistently, and actually fairly cheaply. Resilience planning, that's a whole different thing. How do I run my bank well enough to provide those two services within 24 hours? Significant planning ahead work. By the way, if you do the right planning ahead, it is possible to do this. And if you did no planning ahead, I can guarantee you it's not going to happen. You're gone as an institution. So data vaulting, resilience planning. The last piece was, it goes to that whole trust thing. None of this is meaningful. Okay, you got wiped out and you come to me and I'm another bank that's supposed to interact with you, and you tell me, I think I got some copies of some data that I might be able to use. Can we go ahead and interact with you? And I'm going to say, wait a minute, how do I trust what you got is real? As an industry, we want to be able to trust each other through this scenario. In fact, we want to be able to support each other. The concept of mutual aid was a critical piece. So who's telling me I can trust the data out of your vault? Similar to your plan. How do I know you're actually going to be able to do this? And there came certification, and that Sheltered Harbor performs for its institutions. Built into all of our standards is a control framework that you must pass as an institution to say, okay, your data is truly protected, your plan is truly viable, and you can actually execute on it. And Sheltered Harbor offers that certification to its participants. And that way we are in a position where we could say, okay, that bank, they're certified. They could survive a scenario like this one. And we as an industry can support them. And of course, that gives the regulators some confidence too, that, okay, there's an institution that is actually doing Sheltered Harbor resilience. We have some confidence that they're going to be ready. If they're not, and they're trying to figure it out for themselves, it's a little bit harder to have that same level of confidence. So that's how it works at the high level. If you don't mind, I'm going to move ahead now just to the data vaulting, which is where a lot of people tend to have quick questions. There are two sides to this diagram. The left-hand side is the day-to-day operational thing. On the far left, an institution just runs as it normally does every single day. And every day we ask them to back up critical data as defined by Sheltered Harbor. So we tell you exactly which data sets, which data elements, exactly the structure that we want that put in. We want you to extract that out of your system, put this in Sheltered Harbor standard format, compress it, encrypt it, and transmit it to your vault. Vault. We all kind of understood the idea of putting this thing aside early on, but we didn't fully recognize what does that mean for a vault that's going to be available when everything is silicon dust. And so early on, we went through some significant exercises and worked through, we need all of these characteristics in place for a valid, what we call Sheltered Harbor valid vault. It has to be mutable, meaning the data in there better be exactly what came out of that system of record or we can't trust it. It has to be completely isolated from the systems that got clobbered. If it's not isolated, it too got clobbered, so that the air gapped. The two pieces right there in the middle, survivable and accessible, we discovered are the ones that, in fact, at the time, no institution, even the best prepared, we thought, in the industry, didn't have the full version of survivability and accessible. Survivable, it's got to be available even when all that becomes silicon dust, is still here intact. Accessible is, okay, well, we've encrypted it. We did that for safety. We did that for security. And we discovered that a lot of people assumed they can decrypt it, but they were reliant on stuff that was sitting in a system that no longer existed. Everybody thought, okay, well, I've got this over in my key management system. We said, well, no, that was part of production environment. It's now dust. Where's the key? So accessible and survivable were the critical pieces that were never articulated as a concept of a vault before Sheltered Harbor. The other critical pieces here are decentralized. What does that mean? That means the institution knows where they're putting it. They're not coming to one place. When we first were created, in fact, the industry thought Sheltered Harbor was going to be the utility where everybody popped all this data in. Fortunately, level heads got a quick look at that and said, this is the worst idea we could possibly have. We're not putting all of our eggs in one single basket. We're going to make sure, in fact, that they're distributed. They're decentralized. Each institution determines where their vault is going to be and how their vault is going to be. As long as it meets these criteria, it's a valid vault. And very, very significant associated with that is they control that vault the entire time. Even though they were knocked out by a cyber attack, they still have the say on when we pull data from the vault and go to work against it. Not a regulator, not somebody else in the industry. They have full control of all of that. The reason for that, by the way, is because they're the organization that has the trust of the customer. They have the fiduciary responsibilities and a whole ton of regulations around management of that data. So those are the pieces that make up a vault. And I would say right now to everybody on this call, if you can store your data and meet all of these criteria, go do it right now. Forget the standard data set. And I'm talking right now because of the Ukraine stuff going on. Get it done right now. Make sure you can actually access it if everything else is gone. If you've done that, you've already done yourself and your customers a favor. There's a lot more to the specifics of how it gets done that you'd learn by joining Sheltered Harbor. But at the very least, do that. It's a starting point. So continuing now, this gets done every single day. Every night as part of end-of-day closing, our participants do this. And most of them do it now. It's literally on auto run. So they've almost forgotten that this is happening, but it is critical. And it's critical because if we ever get hit by a cyber attack, the institution, presuming they've created a resilience plan already, activates their resilience plan, moves their data to what we call a restoration platform, a standardized platform that offers those two critical services for them. So if you will, a white label platform. They transmit their data from their vault to here. It gets extracted. Remember, it's standard format, so nobody has to do any thinking about it. It gets popped out onto that platform, and now that platform acts as an interim operational platform for that institution that was down 24 hours ago or 36 hours ago. Doesn't do anything more. Can't answer everybody's information about their balances, and they can't create new mortgages or anything, but they can at least support the existing customers and their balances. That's the entire Sheltered Harbor solution and the approach that we created for the financial services industry.
Thank you. No, that's super, Carlos, and you're spot on in terms of the importance. It's always been important, and every year it becomes more important. And last week, it's more important this week than it was last week because of what's happening around the world. So you can't underestimate or understate the importance of getting this done and making certain that these financial institutions have the right data elements to continue running if and when the time comes. So in terms of this slide, I think it's important to really highlight that organizations don't have to go at this alone. Maybe in the early days, that was kind of the only way of doing it. But today, there's a very broad partner ecosystem that can help you take this journey on, whether or not it's all the way from the data extraction to the data vault to the restoration platform to audit and compliance. And at Cobalt Iron, we're very, very proud to be a part of the Alliance Partner community for the Data Vault. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Data Vault on the upcoming slides here. But I think it is really important that these institutions know that they don't have to go out and build it themselves, right? They have very, very capable partners listed on this slide that can help take them from the beginning of the project all the way through to the end of the certification in a very seamless way with proven technologies, endorsed technologies, and endorsed processes. So for me, being a part, having Cobalt Iron be a part of this elite, I'll say, group of companies to support the Sheltered Harbor mission is absolutely fantastic, and it certainly helps continue to drive not just the awareness of Sheltered Harbor, but the execution of it within these organizations. Anything you'd like to hit on here, Carlos?
I think you touched it extremely well. I can say that, at Sheltered Harbor, the first thing was figuring out what the answer was. We've done that as an industry. Next part is educating the industry, but also educating the support structure. We don't want, in fact, we urge organizations not to try and figure out how to do this all themselves. The solutions are out here. The partners are out here. They have done it before. They know how to do it. They can get you there efficiently. We have designed the approach so that it fits small, medium, and large organizations, and our partners help us ensure that all can participate in the protection that we've defined.
Awesome. No, that's great. I think it's key what you just said about, this is not just for the big guys, right? The big guns, the big dogs out there. This is for every size of financial institution in North America, and hopefully beyond. So let's touch a little bit on what is the Cobalt Iron solution. It's called Compass for Sheltered Harbor. Compass is our data backup and recovery software as a service solution, or software as a service that we deliver to large enterprises on a day-to-day basis. It's pretty interesting. When we first started engaging with Carlos and the Sheltered Harbor team about a year and a half ago, and really learning more about the specifications, learning about the best practices, learning about the architecture, I think both sides were pleasantly surprised to see how close our Compass platform really did come to meeting a lot of already the existing requirements that Sheltered Harbor has. And some of that comes from the fact that our CEO and founder comes from a security background. So security is a big, big part of our corporate DNA. That also is a big, big part of the SaaS platform, the Compass SaaS platform. And it was really interesting that as we started looking at how could we be a Sheltered Harbor solution provider for a turnkey data vault, there were a lot of things that were already in place. Things like, as Carlos mentioned, the importance of data immutability, the importance of having that data air gapped so that, like the dust reference there, if everything goes to dust in one data center or in one location, that you have it air gapped and stored elsewhere. And then, the survivability and accessibility, those were two elements that I found very, very interesting when Carlos was talking about what that meant from a Sheltered Harbor perspective. And then always having all of the data kind of under constant role-based access controls. All of these things were elements that were natively already built into the Compass platform, and something that is just a really refreshing to see another organization that kind of took on security at the same level that we do here at Cobalt Iron. Obviously, there were elements that we had to build out to meet the specific specifications of data extraction and importation and attestation, et cetera. But at the end of the day, it felt very rewarding to find another organization that was very, very close in terms of how we view the world and how we view kind of the mission of protecting our customers' data. In terms of, or in addition to, I should say, in addition to kind of the technology of the data vault that we've come to market with Sheltered Harbor, the other thing that was really important for us was to have multiple multiple deployment options, very flexible deployment options. And when Carlos was saying, this is for the large, medium, and small entities, that's what we had in mind as well, in terms of we need to be able to provide multiple different options so that we can hit every financial institution's requirements. So on the left-hand side, you might have the more traditional large enterprise that has multiple data centers, and that data vault is in a air-gapped, separated location that is replicating to on a daily basis, and that's from one data center on-prem to another data center on-prem. And that's more the traditional model. We also wanted to look at a public cloud option for organizations that might be cloud first in terms of their strategy, or it might be that they're a smaller organization that doesn't necessarily have that secondary location to replicate to a data vault. So in this particular deployment model. You could have, a small regional bank that is replicating into a public cloud data vault. And today we, meaning Cobalt Iron, the Compass platform supports 5 different public cloud options, first being Amazon AWS, IBM Cloud, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform, as well as Alibaba Cloud. So within that framework, again, that company might be cloud first and that's their strategy and they could have their data vault sitting in the cloud. Or it could be a scenario where it's a smaller organization that just doesn't have that secondary location to replicate to. So for us, having these 2 different types of turnkey data vault solutions is one that we'd like to have in market so that every financial institution can choose what's right for them. And the other element of this is I just mentioned that these are very much turnkey solutions, meaning that we can have these data vaults stood up in days, not weeks, not months, with no professional services required. So that's a pretty big differentiator in terms of time to market, go to market.
Yes.
Obviously, there are still elements that the organization needs to work with on the data extraction, restoration platform, and certification, but the actual data vault, there's no reason to go out and build your own these days when you have a solution that is off the shelf, turnkey, and deployable within days. So with that said, I think, Carlos, we're at the end of this webinar. I certainly want to appreciate Carlos for joining us today. We believe deeply in the mission of Shelter Harbor, that we are very passionate and excited to be a partner of Shelter Harbor and look forward to driving the mission into the marketplace, locking arms with Shelter Harbor and making certain that account balances, account information is protected, and if the worst event happens. Carlos, is there anything you'd like to say to wrap up?
I just want to say thank you for the opportunity and very much thank you to Cobalt Iron for doing the work to become a proper Sheltered Harbor type of product that will support organizations that get certified. And we look forward to helping you work your way through this market and certainly look forward to how you will also do it beyond the financial sector. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks again, Carlos, and thank you all who have joined us today. And we look forward to engaging with you. You can engage with us at cobaltiron.com. There is a dedicated Shelter Harbor page where you can learn more, read more, and request more information. Thank you so much.